Today, let's do a deep dive into psychology and transgender and non-binary issues. I have the wonderful pleasure of having the opportunity to interview Cass Eris. So today we're going to talk about her background a little more, her YouTube channel, her psychology background specifically, and breaking down her series on the book Irreversible Damage. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here, Cass.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here.
So let's just kind of jump in. So I know you've amassed a pretty sizable YouTube following discussing a range of topics, mental health, Carl Jung, Jordan Peterson, irreversible damage, and a lot of like general cognitive psych topics. Could you share a little bit about what inspired you to make this channel, like kind of how it came to be?
So the honest truth is I am a trailing spouse at this point. My husband is a PhD physicist, and he landed his dream job at this point. And I didn't have the best exiting of grad school, so I didn't have a lot of publications, which you really need to get any sort of academic job. So I adjuncted during his postdoc, and then in a transition period, I did nothing. Well, I didn't do nothing. I had the first version of a YouTube channel that was pre-adpocalypse, and the adpocalypse hit a couple videos in to me doing, I think, yeah, I've got them on my channel. They're like 5-minute, just pint-sized psych. They're supposed to be like lecture supplements.
Yeah.
And after the adpocalypse, it's like, there's no way this channel in this format would be sustainable. So I switched gears, tried to build up some other skills, and then we moved to Silicon Valley and tried to get jobs as, cognitive psychologists, human factors stuff, but didn't have the best luck there, which is probably for the best. Facebook or Google certainly would have just not a good balance for my mental health. And so let's try this channel again. Do it in a slightly different way where it's not just me talking over animation. Like, I'd be more of a focus, talk about my experiences in like academia as a trailing spouse, and then wanted to focus on like the experimental psychology side of things. And then, let's talk about 12 rules for life, because that is a bit of a scientific train wreck, and I think I have some unique things to talk about that. And then it's just sort of kept going from there.
Sounds like quite the adventure to get to where we are today.
Yeah, life is rarely straightforward.
Just curious, what would be like your ideal job to have with your cognitive psych background?
So I've always really enjoyed doing research, like in the lab, running experiments. In grad school, I got to play around with a driving simulator, which was pretty fun. And I had an idea for a different sort of navigation aid than what we sort of ended up with, but it was pre-smartphone. So yeah, I think ideally I'd be doing research, but I also enjoy teaching and hate at this point the adjuncting scene, because it's just, there's too many PhDs who are willing to do too much work for too little pay that, universities are more than happy to take advantage of that. So adjuncting is not really what I'm interested in, and YouTube is turning into a good platform to kind of do whatever I want to talk about, which is also really nice.
Right. You can do the teaching aspect, but teaching exactly what you want to teach rather than being forced into like a specific box. So kind of talking about your psych background and your degree in cognitive psych, I'm a graduate student in psychology myself. And so I'm kind of curious what drew you into psychology, and more specifically, what, drew you to pursuing a PhD, because, it is a arduous process, to put it nicely.
Yeah, I knew from a very early age I wanted a PhD. I didn't know in what, but I wanted a PhD. I grew up, like, my dad was a huge fan of Harrison Ford, so I saw Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade I don't know how many times. So it's like, Dr. Jones, ooh, I want to be a doctor. That sounds cool. So it's like, I want to do archaeology. No, I want to do, if there's something else. And then like, ooh, marine biology, that's cool. Because in 2010, like the movie, like the 2001 sequel, the one character being like a marine biologist working with dolphins, like, that's cool. I want to do that. And then Contact came out and it's like, ooh, astrophysics. I want to do that. Like, very impressionable. And
sounds like a big influence of like movies too.
Yeah. Well, I came from a working class family. And so me and my husband are both first generation university students, let alone PhD. So it was like, we had no idea what we were doing, just making it up as we go. So it was like, okay, I can do the school stuff. Don't really have much guidance at home on how to point that. So yeah, media was pretty much like where I was getting my information from. Took physics in high school and AP physics and couldn't really do it well. Like my intuitive understanding of the world doesn't match how the world actually works, which seemed like a really bad idea to try to do that as my life's work. Gave it another go in undergrad the first year and just like, and also had a very, like, my favorite professor pretty much ever in psychology for intro psych and then a couple others. And it's like, this is cool. And he was a psychophysicist. So like perception, sensation stuff. And it's like, ooh, this is like the hard science part of psychology. And like, ooh, this is interesting.
Yeah.
And so changed my major and got really into that. Thought for a little bit I wanted to do psychopharmacology because that was like my second favorite professor, but working in the rat lab decided or realized that I can't be in charge of these little ratsos' lives and calling them and just like, nope, not for me.
Too much to handle that.
Yeah. So it's like, when it came time to apply for grad school, it's like, okay, I know roughly, like I'm interested in cognitive, but then it's like, okay, I have to specialize more. Okay. So I sat down with the textbook and like flipped through and like, okay, that's cool. That's cool. That's cool. Looked at cognitive programs where people were doing like those topics. And then that's where I applied. It's
okay.
One way to approach the problem. There's many other ways to approach, but that worked, I guess. Yeah, I've got a video on my channel basically like applying to grad school, and part of it is like learning from what I did. Don't do what I did. Because like I applied just blind, not even talking to who I was applying with. So one of the other professors in the program I got into was saying that like he's willing to bet that some of the other schools I applied to, the professors weren't taking students that year because there's no way they wouldn't have taken me, which like thanks. Okay. But yeah, so don't do what I
did. Another thing I wanted to ask, like relating to psychology and your background, I know, you've talked about like having an interest being drawn towards like cognitive psych. And I think, I've heard you talk about like attention and learning specifically. But I know you've also talked a lot about, like mental health experiences on your channel and your own personal experiences, and a lot on like psychopathology on your channel. So I'm wondering, like, was clinical or counseling psych ever something that was a consideration for you?
I don't really think it was. So in part, where I did my undergrad, we had a child development professor, the psychophysicist, and the guy who was doing psychopharmacology. That was our psych program. It was a small school. So like counseling wasn't even offered. Like to this day, I have never taken a counseling class. The closest I've had was abnormal psych. And so there's that part of it. And there's also just, it's sort of like, it's interesting to understand what's going on, like with my bipolar and anxiety and blah, blah, blah. But I don't feel like I could really help people with that, or even just day-to-day problems on like the less extreme end. Like, I'm okay at compartmentalizing like myself, but then like I feel like there'd be a lot of bleed over from clients, and that just
Okay.
would be bad. So
Right. Like kind of that situation of taking work home when you don't
yeah,
want to.
yeah.
Yeah. But on that note, like another thing I wanted to talk about, like related to like approaching client work and clinical work, I know you've talked a bit on your channel about psychoanalysis and, Carl Jung and, within the context of things like people like Jordan Peterson and Abigail Schreier. So wondering if you could share what your core issues are with these approaches.
I think, and this is something that people have shared in the comments, that, it's important to keep in mind that I'm talking about like Freud and Jung as it was when they concepted it. So the fields have evolved somewhat since then, but
Absolutely.
I'm still a little hesitant to recommend people do it, or use those types of therapists if they have options, because I think both Freud and Jung propose different ways that the mind is organized. And basically, like, there's the conscious experience part and the unconscious experience part. And you go into therapy when you're having problems with stuff in the unconscious that's bubbling up to the surface. And an issue, especially with Jung, is these theories of how the mind works and how personality is structured and all of this aren't really that falsifiable. And to break that down, hopefully quickly, ideally with a scientific, empirical based treatment approach, you're able to have some theory of how personality works, the mind works, trauma works, whatever. And you make predictions based on this theory. And you go out, do the experiments, and either the predictions were held up and your theory is still working, or the predictions aren't working, in which case your theory has been falsified, at least in some regard. And the issue, especially with Jung, is there's always room to, like, oh, this person didn't behave in the way we expected or respond to the treatment in the way we expected. It's because of some other unconscious tangle that's coming into play, and we need to dig deeper to get at that other problem. And it's just, there's always a way to explain it within the theory, but it's not really adding anything. It's just kind of pulling it out of your ass. And it's not a great way to really have an empirically based treatment approach, because it's hard to know how to apply that when you're just almost making it up as you go. So
Right. And we can't really easily measure, or not at all, what our subconscious is doing. So that's like another problem I see there. I mean, what I know from, my brief exposure to you and like some of my counseling classes, like history of like theoretical orientations, is there's a big focus on archetypes. And, that I never really understood how to like really apply that in clinical work in a way that would make sense to my clients and also be helpful for my clients.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I'm like, oh, there's as many archetypes as there needs to be. Like, great. That's helpful.
So kind of taking a, 180 in a different direction, maybe not quite, but let's jump into irreversible damage, because that's definitely one of the big things I wanted to talk about with you. So, given your deep dive into the book, I'm sure you can provide a better summary than I can, but just to give like a concise overview for anybody who's not familiar with the book or familiar with Schreier, Schreier, the author, thinks there's a quote unquote transgender craze that is sweeping away our youth with a focus on our daughters. And I put that in quotes because she frequently misgenders and invalidates trans youth and trans adults, mostly trans youth, as she talks about, that are likely trans boys, trans men, or AFAB non-binary people. But she purports that this craze is prompting tons of youth and young adults who aren't actually trans to transition because they're influenced by others, primarily like YouTube and other forms of social media. It's really delightful stuff. Would you say I kind of captured that well?
Yeah. It's I think I've said it a couple times in my videos on this book where it's just, I don't think Peterson in 12 Rules or Beyond Order has ever made me as mad as Schreier can on just like a random page, because it's just this constant like misgendering of the people she's talking about, like a misogynistic almost view of the youth where like they can't understand themselves. They're youth, they're AFAB. So of course, you know, we need to protect them from themselves. They don't know what they're doing. They're just so vulnerable and they're being taken advantage of by the transgender agenda. And like, no, bad Schreier, especially because it seems like it's causing actual harm in the world at this point.
Yeah.
Or, surprise, Irreversible Damage, good title, good job.
Yeah, just, you know, creating the damage, not talking about damage. So, you know, this book can be pretty harmful and painful. The fact that it exists is harmful and painful, but like, you know, subjecting yourself to reading this can be pretty harmful for somebody who is an ally, even in the slightest sense, of trans and non-binary people. So wondering like what kind of led you to doing such a deep dive on this series? Because I know from seeing your videos that understandably so, it made you pretty angry and upset and uncomfortable in many points. Because I think now you're at 7 videos on this book, which is a pretty deep dive.
Yeah. So again, the honest behind the scenes truth here is I was finishing up 12 Rules in like December, and I knew the sequel to that was coming out in March. So it's like, okay, I've got 3 months where I can basically get through something I thought would be quick. And I thought Schreier's book was going to be easy enough to go through and tackle the issues in it that I could have it done by the time Beyond Order came out. And that didn't end up working out because it is so much worse than I was expecting. And really, like, my goal for the series is maybe somebody who's on the fence about it, wants to see what people are saying about the book, looks it up on YouTube, maybe comes across my videos and like seeing somebody like, this is bad and this is all the reasons it's bad and these are the bad arguments, this is the bad science, this is bad logic, maybe convince them to not buy into the book, maybe. So I feel like I need to go through it and like dismantle every single part of it because there's just so much there that builds on itself. And it's turned into more than a 3-month project.
Yeah, for sure. I'm wondering at this point, would you say you've seen anything in the comments or anybody who's reached out to you that kind of indicates that you've maybe changed the minds of some people that were maybe unsure?
The majority of the comments I've gotten have been from people who are trans and or non-binary and just, thank you for going through this. Like, I don't have to read it now. Like, thank you, or I can send this to my parent or sibling or friend or whatever. The next largest group are turf-ish individuals who either don't watch the video and just like assume I'm saying certain things, or I haven't read the book, which, how is that possible if I'm showing quotes? But anyways,
right.
Or just, you know, this is actually the outcome of this study. You're taking this out of context or just nitpicking the different things. And then small subset of people like, oh, this was interesting, this was educational, this informed me in a way I wasn't informed before. And then subset of that, like nested in there, is a couple people were like, I'm glad I caught this before I read the book because I might have believed it. So there's some, not many, but at least as far as commenters go, there's a couple.
I mean, I think that's great, even just getting a handful of people that can maybe be allies rather than kind of going down the opposite path.
Yeah.
So even if it's just a handful, I think it's still really helpful and successful in my opinion. And you know, you mentioned briefly there some things about like you're misinterpreting the findings of this study, and people making comments like that. And
Yeah.
I want to get to that in a minute because that makes me think of that one particular paper on rapid onset gender dysphoria. But kind of before we get that, just looking at the book again more in like big picture, this might require some speculation, but from a psychology perspective or otherwise, why do you think people like Schreier invest such a large amount of time and probably energy into fighting against trans and non-binary issues, rights, people, when I would argue that these issues hardly, if at all, affect people like her on a regular basis?
I don't think there's one black and white answer for like where people are coming from with this.
Sure.
So yeah, this is just going to be rampant speculation at this point. So it seems like part of Schreier's motivation is maybe a combination of like the disappearing lesbians idea, where like trans men and trans boys would have otherwise just been cis lesbians had they not been indoctrinated or transed by the media or whatever. So that idea, a general protect our vulnerable girls as they don't know what's going on and blah, 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 blah. Because she really plays into that argument of, you know, the youth that are falling for this craze today would have been hysterical in the 1800s. They would have had anorexia in the 90s. Right. Like, you know, they would have had any of these things. And it's just that this is the craze of today. And I also think for Schreier, part of it might be that she might kind of see herself in these youth because like myself, like grew up in the 80s and 90s. She's a little bit older than me, but very much a tomboy and not really wanting to fit into the woman role as it was in society at that point. And like, I would be offended at McDonald's if I got the girl toy. And so I think Schreier potentially maybe thinks that if she was growing up today, she might identify as trans and hates that idea.
Okay.
Again, just speculation, because
sure.
One of the stories she's talking about where she, I guess in college, she toyed around with the idea of getting a breast reduction because she was uncomfortable with the size of her breasts. And her parents talked her out of it. And to this day, she is grateful because it allowed her to breastfeed her children. Never mind that, you know, you can have that done and breastfeed anyway. And, you know, not everybody can breastfeed and just so many other factors. Right. It was fulfilling for her, and childbearing was fulfilling for her, which she didn't think would be the case in her early 20s. And so I think to her, because of those things, that means that maybe she would have identified as trans or non-binary and gone down a different life path, and that is just unconscionable to her. And so everybody else might think like she thought, and she's happy being a mom now, therefore right. She needs to protect all these kids from making the decisions that would prevent them from ending up in a life position like she's in now. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, all that makes sense to me. And, you know, but there's also like, seems like there's so many like hoops and mental gymnastics that has to be at play to kind of tie those experiences to like trans identity and gender transition and things like that. Because as you've said in your videos, and I'm sure you know very well, that like gender and sexuality aren't even remotely the same thing. They're, you know, maybe associated in many cases, but they're separate ideas altogether. But it seems like, among other things, she muddles it.
The interesting thing for me too, because it's like, you know, I feel like on some level, like, yes, I was also a tomboy and went through these sort of similar experiences, but very different outcome where it's like, I don't want kids still. And like, I can understand that, like, I have probably body dysmorphia, where just not happy with how things are, but I'm comfortable in my gender, at least as I get to express it. And I don't feel like my body is wrong for me. And so not saying, just to have the caveat that, you know, trans and or non-binary people can be trans or non-binary without gender dysphoria. So just making sure that's
Absolutely.
out there.
Yeah.
But like, you know, my body is right-ish. There's just things I'd like to tweak. It's not that it's things are very wrong and I need to change them and it's causing great distress. Like I can see where somebody experiencing gender dysphoria could feel that way. And I think she just can't for some reason.
Right.
So it's weird to me that like such a different path.
So many disconnects. And one of the questions I put together before this kind of relates to that idea of like, there's lots of logical leaps and disconnects and the stuff Schreier talks about. And I think in your second video on this book, you quoted, you know, an Abigail that I think many of us like much more, Abigail Thorne from Philosophy Tube. And you quote her saying, "We're figuring out if the argument justifies the conclusion." And you discuss how many of Schreier's conclusions are not supported due to leaps in logic, among other issues. So, I mean, it might be hard to like concisely pack this into like our conversation, but what would you say are some of like the biggest or most troubling or whatever stands out to you most in terms of logical leaps Schreier makes, and why would they not justify the conclusion? Why would her arguments not justify the conclusion she's making in those cases?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest logic jumps is just that these youth don't really understand themselves. And so therefore they can't identify as whatever identity because they can't understand themselves at that age, where it's like we have so much data that, you know, kids do understand themselves. And they like Zucker had the lovely quote from him of like, you know, if a kid says they're a dog, do you buy him dog food? Like, it's not equivalent. Okay. Like,
Yeah.
a kid, I think, can understand the difference between like, I'm a dog today and I'm a boy or I'm a girl or I'm not really either. And like, there's a
Right.
difference. And like, yeah, it's just, I think kids don't get enough credit in Schreier's work with their understanding of themselves and their ability to express themselves and how they come to have the vocabulary to express themselves. So part of her argument is, you know, this is social media's fault and the influencers and also just society in general. But to her, I think it's a causal thing where like you have trans influencers who make it look all shiny and appealing somehow. And that makes youth think that this will fix their lives instead of youth searching out these things because, you know, there's something that isn't matching what's being talked about and they end up finding like a YouTube video or not MySpace, wow, Tumblr,
Facebook.
yeah,
Or,
Facebook.
yeah.
They find a group, they find something that like resonates with them, and then they go down, search it more, find the vocabulary, and then they're able to talk about what they're experiencing. Like it's sort of a different causal mechanism there. And just not being willing to listen to kids on what they're experiencing is so damaging. And I think maybe part of why I can be empathetic here is growing up, like my mood disorder showed up when I was in middle school, and my dad recognized that. And so pretty early on, like I had an understanding that, you know, this is just part of how I'm wired. This is my brain chemistry. It's not my fault that I feel this way. And so I've always had the vocabulary to talk about it in that way, and the understanding that, you know, this is just part of how it is. And so I think kids, if they have an opportunity for that, with like gender identity or expression, you know, it can really change the way that life plays out for them in a positive way. And it's not something that we need to necessarily like shield them from, which I think is something Schreier thinks needs to happen. And then relying on the Littman paper that you mentioned for rapid onset gender dysphoria is just a huge problem in and of itself, but something that the gender critical community likes to rely on. So
yeah, it's, I think, something that it's a huge form of confirmation bias. Yeah. And I guess we can go ahead and jump into that, the 2018 paper from Littman. And she defines, I think this is where the term came from, rapid onset gender dysphoria, as a, quote, phenomenon where the development of gender dysphoria is observed to begin suddenly during or after puberty in an adolescent or young adult who would not have met criteria for gender dysphoria in childhood. And like you mentioned, like this paper forms, a lot of central arguments. I mean, I would say that a lot of what Schreier talks about is based on, thinking that ROGD is a valid, like, studied, defendable concept. So, it's used by many people to often discredit the experiences of gender dysphoria, some cases trans and non-binary identities altogether. So I'm wondering if you could explain, like, from Littman's study, what some of her conclusions were and why specifically, like, how that study was designed raises questions about those conclusions that she made.
Right. So I think, Littman's paper is probably where a lot of different things that were out in just the internet space solidified, because she surveyed parents of kids who were using a couple different websites. I forget like the exact handles, but basically they were not very trans friendly. And a lot of these parents had the impression that, their kid isn't trans or non-binary. Like, no, there was no sign of that at any point. And so they sort of formed like these Facebook groups or these websites for support. And that's where Littman got her data from, the parents of the kids who suddenly and spontaneously developed gender dysphoria. And if the stories that Schreier shared in her book are anything to go by, like, these parents are not seeing a lot of the characteristics that are pretty friggin' obvious. One of the stories that Schreier shared, the parent, like in the description from the parent, the kid said they were trans, like in middle school, but there was no previous evidence of them being trans. Like, it didn't happen. So it certainly seems like Littman was working with a very biased data set. And it was published in PLOS ONE, which is a journal that has its pros and cons. It is a journal where basically you have to pay to get it in, instead of a lot of other journals where if you pay, it's just to make it open access, or there's no paying involved to get it published, which does give me a little bit of pause for most things published in there. The editorial process can be a bit lighter touch than it is with other journals. And I think we definitely saw that with what Littman published. And with the pushback that happened after it was published, there were a couple corrections, but the paper wasn't retracted, which I think a lot of people would have preferred. But even with the corrections, it's not good, because it's pulled from websites, like I was saying, where parents are looking for support for having a spontaneously trans or non-binary identifying child. And so it's like they're going to answer in ways in line with that, instead of seeking out parents who are supportive of their trans or non-binary kid. And certainly if Littman was honestly and legitimately trying to validate if rapid onset gender dysphoria is a separate type of gender dysphoria from early onset and late onset, she would have sought out that sort of disconfirming evidence as well, or at least criteria for like, okay, if we have a bunch of parents of transgender non-binary youth, are there differences between them? Like, are there differences in how the kids manifested the disorder, or the gender dysphoria? Is there any way we can talk to the kids directly to see what their experience is when they feel like it started? Which is just such a glaring error of, like, why are we not talking to the kids in all this?
It just doesn't make sense to me to try to create a new diagnosis or subset of a diagnosis that doesn't involve the people that are supposedly experiencing the diagnosis.
Yeah. To draw a parallel, I think we're also seeing consequences and effects of that with, like, autism, where for so long it was, researchers who were trying to understand it but weren't really asking people what was going on with it, and so weren't seeing, like, women with it because it was only using the diagnostic criteria for what it was understood as with boys, and it is changing, at least, but getting the people involved who are experiencing it and taking what their experiences are at face value is probably a good research tool in general, or approach.
If, we say that, at least at this point in time, rapid onset gender dysphoria, the validity of it is highly questionable based off of the existing research. Do you think that a lot of the core argument that Schreier is making in her book kind of falls apart if rapid onset gender dysphoria is not a valid diagnosis?
It certainly becomes more difficult. And I think part of why she brought in the dissidents of Blanchard, Bailey, Zucker, Marciano, McHugh, like other psychologists, psychiatrists, other people in this field, in an attempt to sort of broaden where her argument's coming from. So it's not just Littman, it's also these other guys who are saying similar things, but in slightly different ways. But yeah, like, it's interesting that the chapter where she focuses on therapists and speaks to somebody who works with gender nonconforming youth or transgender non-binary, there's quotes from this therapist about, we need to support these kids. There is an increased risk of suicide, especially in families who are not supportive. There are good quotes there. And a lot of times Schreier either tries to twist it as, like, oh, talking about the suicide statistics is just emotional manipulation, or just ignores the quote, which is just a bit dumbfounding almost, because, like, okay,
I include it if you're going to ignore it.
Like, way to just talk past that, I guess. So yeah, it's like she did bring a little bit of a counter opinion, but it is very much loaded on the side of people who have a long history of thinking that a trans identity is this box, and if you do not fit this box, it's no good. And even in that box, you're not going to be happy being trans, and so we need to try to get you to accept your birth gender, and we really need to try to get you to do that. And if that fails, only then can we consider doing other procedures or surgeries or whatever. And even then, like McHugh, who was formerly at Johns Hopkins, he was never a fan of surgery for people, which, great, good job, guy. But he's not there anymore.
Wasn't he a big reason why, like, John Hopkins stopped doing surgeries for like several decades, I think, and only recently started doing them again?
Yep.
Yeah. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot in there that you said that kind of relates to some other things I want to talk about. So kind of just go by it piece by piece. And, you mentioned people like Blanchard, Bailey, who focus a lot on, trans women and this concept of autogynephilia. But, I find it interesting that Schreier brings in these arguments, considering the book focuses entirely, to my knowledge, on, assigned female at birth individuals, so like trans boys, trans men, AFAB non-binary people. So I'm wondering, how does Schreier's discussion on Blanchard and Bailey fit with kind of the rest of Schreier's book and her arguments?
It's interesting, and I'm surprised like an editor or herself didn't catch this, because when she first talks about autogynephilia, she defines it in a way that includes like trans men, trans women, like it's possible for everybody. But then later, when getting into the specifics and actually quoting Bailey, then we get more in line with what is published in the literature for autogynephilia, where it is exclusively, I can speak, for AMAB individuals. I don't know if she really would have gone into Blanchard if it wasn't for Bailey's The Man Who Would Be Queen, where he talked about, Blanchard's research with the typologies of transsexualism and all of that. Because it's kind of outdated at this point. And Bailey's The Man Who Would Be Queen was a huge book that is still relatively influential in certain circles. So it's a weird fit altogether.
Just kind of as a side note, I have, plenty of thoughts on this, but why do you think autogynephilia is a thing, but something like, I don't know, autoandrophilia isn't a thing?
Talking with my husband last night about this, and he brought up, and it's something that didn't even occur to me, that a lot of research history, the researchers are guys, like Blanchard, Bailey, guys, so they're interested in studying trans women for whatever reason, and just it's inconceivable, especially historically, that women could have a sex drive and be either attracted to themselves as women or an AFAB person being attracted to themselves as a man. Like, inconceivable, not possible. It's only a guy thing. And again, like not listening to the patients necessarily, or the people experiencing these things. And I think I touched on this in the Blanchard Bailey video, where it's possible, I think, that autogynephilia may be a product of the time, where just it was our understanding of human sexuality that guys were very visual, guys or whatever, and AMAB people then would be very just always driven by their target sexuality or their target of desire. And so for somebody who is an autogynephilic, that would mean themselves as a woman for some reason. And I mean, Blanchard interviewed people who this was their experience, and you can't deny their experience. But as our understanding of sexuality has changed and society has changed, I wouldn't be surprised if that sort of dies off as people with different understandings of how to express themselves sexually and what they are allowed to be attracted to changes. So
and I've heard stories of people who do fit that kind of description of autogynephilia, but I think when we start talking about how this concept is used as like a gatekeeping tool, or used as a concept to differentiate like true transsexuals from pseudo transsexuals, as some of the old terms were, that's when it gets like really problematic. And I think that's a lot of what it's been used to try to discredit or gatekeep. Where do I want to go next? Let's talk about our good friend Zucker. So you spent a good bit of time focusing on Dr. Kenneth Zucker, who, at least in some circles, was considered a leader for decades in the area of trans healthcare. And you did touch on this briefly already today, but I'm wondering if you could kind of go into why a lot of people have described Zucker's approach as being conversion therapy or reparative therapy.
So Zucker, in his treatment with Toronto, it was CAMH, Canadian Mental, great with acronyms, but the main gender clinic in Toronto was sort of his, at least for youth. And so somebody coming in for treatment who was gender nonconforming in some way would go through a battery of assessments, including like intelligence testing, a bunch of play therapy where, you know, they're playing with the therapist or a student, and just a very long process to diagnose them with gender dysphoria, or, you know, they don't need further treatment. And it gets into the conversion therapy realm when these kids, like if they showed up at like 5 years old, would have to go through probably 6 or 7 years of treatment to, one, try to figure out the root cause of their gender dysphoria. Like if there was something going on with the family, some trauma, like there had to be a reason for them to be feeling the way that they were. And also the second reason it kind of gets into conversion therapy territory is they were encouraged to accept the gender they were assigned at birth. So if you had an AMAB youth coming in who was interested in playing with Barbies, like dressing up in mommy's clothes, whatever, Zucker's advice would be, you know, no more Barbies, no more girl friends. Like they only have boyfriends from here on out. They play with G.I. Joe. They do the boy things. They do the boy sports, boy, 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 to try to get them comfortable with their birth sex. And only after they're an adolescent and this has failed do they get to consider doing hormonal therapies or pursuing gender confirming things. And that is many years of just not great treatment that is telling the kid that you're not okay. There is something wrong with you, and the way you're feeling is why you're here. And so it really stigmatizes and just so problematic that it's telling these kids that for so many years, and you know that will take years and years of unlearning when they're an adult and can get other treatment. So I think those are the two big things that put him into the maybe conversion therapy camp. And I think part of the issue is also the view that a lot of the kids coming in, you know, if we could just get them out of whatever they're feeling, you know, they'll later identify as a cis gay person. And this is the best course of option for them because they don't have to go through the surgeries, they don't have to go through the hormones, they don't have to worry about passing. Like there's not all of those things associated with it. So if we can just get them to accept this, they'll avoid all these other things down the road. So I think he saw it as harm reduction or harm prevention. I think that's definitely where Bailey falls on things, but it's sort of denying the experience of these kids going through the treatment themselves.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe I think you mentioned like if the child ended up being trans, the treatment was described as a failure, but it's described as a success if the child turns out to not be trans.
Right.
And that just feels very backwards and gross to describe it that way.
Yeah. Language has power, and certainly it probably isn't unintentional that the success and failure is stacked in that way. But again, from his perspective in treatment, like they failed to reduce the later harm that would be coming from these surgeries and hormones and everything else that the person feels they need. So,
you know, another point I want to bring up is like that the ICD-11 no longer groups any of these diagnoses under mental health diagnoses. It's been switched to gender incongruence under sexual health, I think is the broader category. But because there is this concern and very real concern of access to care. But I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on gender dysphoria being a mental health diagnosis in the first place, just given, you know, there's the access to care piece, but there's still, it's less stigmatizing, but there's still a lot of stigma.
Yeah, that's a tricky thing. And it's one of those things where the sort of emphasis when I took abnormal psych is, there's sort of the 3Ds of psychological disorders. There's dysfunction in terms of the person's ability to function because of what they're experiencing. There's distress experienced because of whatever the thing is, like anxiety, depression, gender dysphoria. And then there's deviancy, which is such a lovely term, but just breaking the societal norms in some way or the cultural norms for how a person acts. So like for depression, there is some low mood expected, but depression goes above and beyond or below the mood that is deemed normal in society. And so you get the deviancy there. And so I think just looking at it from that, completely divorced of all cultural implications and everything, I think a lot of people who experience gender dysphoria are experiencing distress at the mismatch, and it can cause dysfunction. Like if they're not comfortable feeling how they're feeling in their skin, it can be difficult to engage in social activities. They might not go to school, or like they might skip classes, they might skip work. It can have impacts on their function. So I think certainly it's meeting two of the Ds, definitely. But then you bring in the greater cultural context where something that I wasn't aware of before starting the series, but has been explained to me very graciously by people, is the idea of like gender euphoria, where instead of focusing on the negative parts of like not being happy with your body, parts where your gender expression and identity like are affirmed and it's feeling good and you're loving yourself. So yeah, there's that aspect where, it doesn't have to necessarily just be focusing on the negative. And also that we aren't living in a bubble. There are people who take things too far where, oh, you have a psychological disorder of some form, you are not credible as a person anymore and you should be locked up. Like I've gotten that on my comments with just having bipolar. Like I can't be trusted. I've got crazy eyes. Like really? Anyway. So I can see concern about the medical nature of keeping gender dysphoria a psychological disorder. Flip side of that is a lot of like US healthcare uses the DSM codes for things and not the ICD. So if we're going to get people care that's covered, we need to sort of jump through those hoops. And then we hit something that Schreier loves to harp about, where people are basically being told what they need to tell doctors in order to receive care. It may not be the total truth, but it's enough of the truth that they're getting the treatment that they need. So at that point, need to go back and revisit the criteria, and are we being overly restrictive and gatekeepy with things where we don't really need to be? And it just complex issue.
Yeah, for sure. And I didn't expect you to have like a cut and dry or easy answer for that, because I don't think anybody really does at this point, because there's so many aspects to it.
Well, some people do.
Because
just none for anybody.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. But
I mean, it's not, it's
a nuanced issue for sure, just because it's like we want to have access to care. Like I want to have access to care, and I can realize that me having diagnosis of gender dysphoria can be stigmatizing in some ways, but it's also allowed me to get access to things like hormones and surgeries that I would not have been able to afford otherwise. So it's like very complicated in terms of like how much stigma is justifiable is one way I'm thinking of it, and preferably there shouldn't be any. Kind of just as a final question about this book about irreversible damage, I can imagine based off of your videos and everything we've talked about today that you probably wouldn't recommend this book to anyone, especially not to like parents of trans or non-binary youth. But I'm wondering, what would you maybe recommend as a good resource? And like, are there any books, are there resources that you have found particularly helpful, like on your journey of becoming an ally for trans and non-binary people?
I think the biggest resource is honestly just listening to people. So if you have people that you can reach out to in your life, great. If not, a lot of people are sharing stories online through YouTube, Tumblr. Like there's so many places where people are talking about their experiences and what it's like and challenges they face and what they could use from allies or family members or friends. Where, you know, if you're curious to learn more, there are many people talking about their many different experiences, because there is some intersectionality with this too, where like somebody who is a person of color will have a different experience than like somebody who's white, and
Right.
hearing about the differences there can be very interesting. I don't really have a book suggestion or resource like that.
Sure.
Because honestly, most of the help has come in the form of comments and DMs of like, you could have said this a little better, or here's a thing you didn't know about, like the gender euphoria. Like, I had no idea. And then it was explained to me, like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So just, I think being willing to listen and ask questions and have a dialogue is really the biggest thing I think that can help people understand what it's like for trans and or non-binary people.
Yeah, absolutely. Learning from the people who experience it, which is unfortunately a relatively recent concept when we look at like a lot of the research and approaches to trans people especially. But kind of just as a fun closing question, what does the future hold for you in terms of YouTube or otherwise?
So at some point I would like to shift into stop shitting on books. Like there's a couple books here that I'd like to go through, like he probably has a more recent one, but The Quest for Consciousness, where basically trying to find the neural correlates of consciousness, like trying to connect our conscious experience to where it is coming from in the brain, is an interesting problem in neuropsychology and cognitive. Another avenue I'm interested in talking about is like the history of drugs, basically like recreational drugs and medical drugs, because it is an interesting path, especially in the US, where, you know, for a long time, like cocaine, morphine, whatever, yeah, it's totally fine. You can just buy it, and then like, oh no, you can't. You can't buy anything. So what caused those different changes and what was happening in society that went along with these is interesting, and then something I'd like to go into, as well as more perception and cognitive and stuff. So, but if Peterson keeps putting out 12 more rules, got job security for some time. And also the trans book that just came out might be following Schreier's.
Goody.
Yeah.
Can't wait.
It's like, okay, Schreier got this published talking about trans people. Okay, like let's go even worse. Like, yeah.
Yeah. I imagine for your own well-being, it's probably good to mix in more positive stuff or more books that are more enjoyable.
Yeah.
So is there anything else we didn't discuss that you'd want to share before we kind of wrap up today about you or anything on your YouTube or anything at all?
I don't think so. Yeah, I mean, it's been great doing the interview. I like talking with people, so just talking to a camera.
Yeah, I agree. Well, yeah, on that note, thank you again so much for taking the time. This has been great. I think, it's been nice to meet you and then get all the, your perspective, like real and like in real time on all the videos I've seen. So that's been really cool. And hopefully, my audience will enjoy this as well. But yeah, thank you for everyone who has watched this. If you have not done so already, please be sure to give this a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And go over and check out Cass's channel if you have not done so already. Make sure to put a description or a link somewhere down in the description for that. All right. Bye, everyone.